Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Paul Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is Barney Frank, who represented the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts for more than 3 decades. Congressman Frank was a masterful liberal strategist and one of the first openly gay members of Congress. He worked on behalf of a range of issues, among them LGBT rights and affordable housing. He was also a force in financial reform, and with Senator Chris Dodd, helped create the 2010 Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Barney Frank retired from Congress in 2013, but he continues to serve as a political commentator and a force for social justice. This is our second episode with Barney Frank. In the first, we dealt primarily with his personal beliefs, his background, and his life and career. In the second episode, we'll discuss his general views of politics and society as it has evolved over his lifetime. Barney Frank, welcome back to the Drexel Interview. Well, you're a great advocate of government properly applied, properly used. And this is a leitmotif, I feel, of your recent memoir, Frank.
Very much so.
And you feel that Republicans in the past understood this. You give the example of Nixon's support for the Clean Air and Water Act and the fact that it saved so many children from lead poisoning, for example. Yet you make the point that certain people now, particularly white, working class and middle class men, for whom these sorts of things have been helped by such legislation in the past and would be helped, are no longer supporting government. Can you address why this paradox?
Yeah, and it's the central issue for me, for Democrats, for liberals, for the country, because we suffer from this anti-government attitude so that we are not doing things that would improve the quality of life of all of us. I'm a great believer in the free market, and I want to help it do what it can with proper regulation. But it's not going to do a lot of the things that we need. And there is this paradox that many of the people who would most benefit from a good government set of rules vote against it. Initially, the view was, and I talked about it a little bit in our last episode, that the radicalism of some students and of African Americans, that violence, the anti-war demonstrations, that culturally alienated a lot of working class people, and that's true. But I think that began to deplete when the violent, angry demonstrations went away, so that Bill Clinton didn't suffer from this nearly as much. But he was suffering from something else that is now fully blossomed. And the second explanation people had was, well, these white working class people, they don't like gay rights, they don't like abortion, they don't think the liberals are properly religious. I wasn't sure about that. I no longer think that's valid. Guns hurt us. There are areas where we lose votes because we're seen as for gun control. And there are some frictions on the environment. But even that's derivative. The gay rights has gone forward. It's clearly, everybody in the country is now overwhelmingly. That's not the reason white guys don't vote for us, especially when they found out they have cousins, sons, et cetera, who are gay. I think the issue is this, a little complicated. From 1940, when World War II began and it ended our depression, and America became the arsenal of the world, and then after World War II ended until the mid-70s, America was we were the king of the world economically. Everybody else had been devastated. Americans sold the steel and the cars and the glass and the rubber. If you were a working class man without any advanced degree or particular set of skills, you were willing to work, you were a white guy, because women and blacks didn't have it wasn't as fair, you could make a good living. And over time, that began to change in the mid-70s. The rest of the world kind of caught up with us. Developing nations began to compete at low-end manufacturers. Other nations began to compete. The Middle East countries raised the price of oil. And pretty steadily from the late 70s on, the position of white working class people without a lot of highly developed skills or advanced degrees began to erode. The problem we talk about now of excessive inequality, that has its roots in the way the world economy works, and particularly the American economy. The way America took its place in the world, if you were in the high-end occupations, that was good for you because America sold that stuff. But if you were in the less skilled occupations, you were losing out. And the problem, I think, is this. The white working class people, we're talking about middle class people, it's not that they are philosophically opposed to government. Quite to the contrary, they believe that government can be very powerful. And yet they see that the government is doing nothing to help them. And they therefore say, okay, what's going on? So they are really mad at the people who've been running the government because they think we have not used government well. That's where the race and other things come in. Some of them think, oh, that's because we're helping the blacks. Not accurate, because black unemployment has unfortunately not gone down. It's worse than white unemployment. But I think that's the issue. People are angry that government isn't the way it used to be with Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. But then we get into a vicious cycle. Because they're mad that government doesn't deliver for them, they punish the government by voting for people who are even less likely to deliver for them.
So because the government is just not doing anything for them, they turn against it.
Yeah, I don't sing well. And you're of a generation, remember this. I talked to some college students. They never heard the song. The song is Winchester Cathedral. Winchester Cathedral, you're letting me down. You didn't do nothing when my baby left town. And there's one couplet. You could have done something. You didn't do nothing. I think that's the attitude towards government of a lot of white people. Why did this government, well, look what Franklin Roosevelt did, and Harry Truman, and even Kennedy and Johnson. Where was this government when I needed it? I'm voting for these people who understand how bad it is. And we got to break that vicious cycle, and my solution is easily formulated, not so easily implemented. I believe this, given that these people like government, if we could, and they like a lot of things government does. They like the Veterans Affairs Department, they like Medicare, they like Social Security. Sadly, they don't think of it as government. If we could restore the situation where a working class kid could go to college without getting deeply indebted, if we could pick up some of the burden of health care by providing more publicly supported health care, if we could put more construction workers back to work steadily by building infrastructure and other things that we need, I think you would get these people to say, gee,
but Obama's trying to do some of these things, and he's abhorred.
Right. And here's the problem. He's trying to do these things without, I think, focusing on the two things you need to do to accomplish it. The problem is you don't have the money to do it. You don't have the resources. Even healthcare. Healthcare was unpopular under Obama and under Clinton because he didn't have any additional money to put in. So we were trying to extend healthcare to people who didn't have it. So the people who had it, including a lot of white, middle, and other guys, said, oh, he's taking my health care, he's going to diminish it to give it to those poor people. If Obama and Clinton each had an extra $100 billion to put into health care, you wouldn't have had such political contrast. So the question is, how do you find that money? Now, one way to be to raise taxes, but by definition, when people hate the government, they're not going to vote to raise taxes. So I believe there are two things we need to do to provide the resources to fund the things the president wants to do, and exactly right. One, substantially reduce American military spending. If we had not gone into Iraq, and I'm very proud to have voted against that, we'd have $1 trillion that we didn't have before. And you could, Western Europe, let them defend themselves. The world war is over. We could cut back on some of the nuclear weapons. We have plenty. The day after the election of 12, two Republicans, active Air Force advocates, said, you know, I'm worried. They're worried that Obama won't expand the Air Force. And they said, it's true that no American has been killed by hostile air power since 1953. And America dominates the airspace of every battle. And because of that, some people don't realize we need to expand the Air Force so we can go anywhere, anytime, any place. We could substantially reduce the military and still have more than we needed to be safe and to protect some allies. And secondly, I wish the conservatives would be as intelligently critical of the war on drugs as they are on the war on poverty. The war on drugs is an unmitigated disaster. It is expensive. It is destabilizing. We should not be locking people up in prison because of their recreational use of drugs. We can offer them treatment, et cetera. If you were to do that, you would free up so much money that we could then provide higher education, increase medical care, increase construction work, and do other things that would make people pro-government again.
So to summarize, to not raise taxes, decrease spending in the military, and stop the war on drugs.
And use that money, partly for the deficit, to do all the things that we know would diminish inequality, improve the quality of life, and you would then maybe maybe you could demonstrate to people, yeah, the government is on your side, and the government is going to diminish this inequality.
I want you to address some of the aphoristic statements that you have made over the years that I find particularly cogent. Here's one. Whenever you give someone a reason for a decision that is not your real reason, you leave yourself vulnerable. I mean, that seems commonsensical.
Yeah, but people don't understand
People don't do it, and in politics
you'll be in a debate
particular.
And you say, well, I don't want you to do that because of this. So very often I'll say, okay, you're right, we won't do that. And then they're left. I mean, you come up with a reason that's not your real reason, and someone satisfies you. Well, I don't like it because you don't say such and such. I said, you know what, I think you're right, we'll say such and such. Well, then if that's not your real reason, then you're stuck. What do you do?
I like this statement too. You say you always support the most liberal candidates electable, with the edge going toward electability. I wonder if you'd elaborate a little bit and give an example, perhaps.
Yeah, that's
of
a kind of self-discipline. Well, Bill Clinton in '92, my former colleague Maxine Waters and I joined the Clinton campaign. There was some dissatisfaction for some on the left with him, and we thought he was clearly the most liberal electoral. I'll give you an example where I was wrong on that. Michael Dukakis, I say in the book, Michael Dukakis ran for re-election as governor in 1978. I unwisely opposed him. I supported a third candidate that weakened him, and he lost to a conservative.
You also make the point that it's easy to oppose one's foes. It's hard to oppose one's allies. And you've been in that situation a number of times throughout your career, particularly with respect to LGBT rights.
Yes, strategically, I have to tell people.
Could you give us a few of those examples, or an example?
Yeah, the March on Washington in 1993, when we were dealing with the gays and the military issue. And, you know, the African Americans had a march on Washington in 1963 that was a marvelously disciplined political event. And they went to Washington, but they talked about politics, and they were very careful. John Lewis, who was one of the great heroes of my generation, was then a young man representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He had to submit, he said, something like 6 copies of his speech before they would approve it, because he didn't want to look too radical. And then we had a march on Washington in '93, which was totally self-indulgent and alienated people. The better you feel emotionally, probably the less good you're doing for your cause.
That's an interesting
Yes,
line. The better you feel emotionally, the more feel good
right, because
with your
you're
peers.
reinforcing each other, and you're not reaching out to other people. I thought people made a mistake when we did the anti-discrimination bill. Most gay people agreed at the time. They've since kind of been pressured into the other way. I thought if we could pass a law that banned discrimination based on sexual orientation, even if we couldn't include transgender, that was a good thing, because it would make it easier to reach out for the transgender. We originally tried to include all. We didn't have the votes for it. That was a very angry debate that people had. Look, there's now this movement on the part of LGBT people. Instead of a bill narrowly aiming at preventing discrimination in employment, they want one that covers everything. And they say, well, we got to do it because that's what the blacks did with the Civil Rights Bill of '64. Except it wasn't. The Civil Rights Bill of '64 didn't cover voting. It didn't cover housing. You rarely get everything all at once, and you multiply your opposition. So that is an example. Look, I'll give you as a broader example now regarding Israel. And my argument to some of my friends in AIPAC and elsewhere is that it is precisely because America has, I believe, Israel's best interests at heart that we will disagree with Netanyahu. I think if you have a friend who is doing something that you think is damaging, as I think his pronouncements on, no, I don't want a two-state solution, well, maybe I do. I think
that was a purely political statement.
I know, but it's.
But again, it's like what you
said.
You don't say
exactly.
something. Yeah.
I mean, now, if he were to offer a good deal to the Palestinians and they turned it down, he would have a hard time saying they're being unreasonable. They say, oh, he's not serious. So that's an example of standing up to your friends and saying what you're doing is not in your interest. And I have to be honest with you.
The LGBT or gay rights movement should take lessons from the NRA.
Yes.
Tell me why. Tell us.
The National Rifle Association is very effective because they own the political process. They make sure all their members are registered to vote. They notify their members if a bill is coming up that they may not like. Their members know the name of everybody who represents them in the city council, the state legislature, and Congress. And what they do is to let people know, I'm here and I don't want you to vote for that. And then if people do vote, they go out to the polls and they vote. That's very effective. They don't have demonstrations. They don't have shoot-ins or die-ins. You don't see an NRA march. We march and they vote. Voting beats marching.
So it's about strategy, discipline, rigor, understanding the opposition. You're a politician, so you want that brought to bear. You though do see the value of this of the other kind of activism. Doesn't it bring things to the public consciousness in a way that's necessary before you can then go and do the...
Well, first place, not all bringing to the consciousness is good. The March on Washington in 1993 was a self-indulgent march for gay people that brought attention in a bad way. One lesbian comedian said on C-SPAN, "Oh, isn't it great," talking about Hillary Clinton, "there's now a first lady with whom I would like to have sex," being more graphic. Well, yeah, I mean, not all exposure is good, and you need to be even disciplined about that. And secondly, there was this view that it's sort of self-executing. Now, getting your people organized, having them engage in expressive activity is a useful part of ultimately getting them into the political process. So yes, having marches, and then at the end of it, let's have, well, I complained to the Occupy people that they never had voter registration tables at the Occupy sites. The Tea Party was much better politically than Occupy, and I wish it had been the other way around.
You feel that they didn't have an end goal.
Right, no, they just thought that expressing themselves would somehow carry. I mean, I asked, there was a group, a man named Dustin Lance Black came up with a notion of having a march on Washington just before the election in 2010, and said, well, I said, why are you doing this? Well, we're going to put pressure on Congress. I said, no, you're going to put pressure on the grass, on the wall. Congress isn't even there. Members of Congress don't care about demonstrations. They don't know who's in them. I mean, the demonstrations can be a useful way to generate enthusiasm if you then have a follow-through so that enthusiasm results in things that have an effect. As for demonstrations, sometimes they can be helpful. In the South, where there was just this unbelievable brutality on the part of the whites, that was helpful. And if you do it in a dignified way and call attention to it, but if you demonstrate in a way that alienates the people you're trying to persuade, that's not a good idea.
I wonder if some of this, what you're saying now, connects to another point you make in the book, which I found very interesting, which is you were one of the few people that knew the House rules.
Yes.
You knew the rules, and that by knowing the rules, you were able to operate with them in a way that other people couldn't. And I think this is part and parcel of your whole, gestalt.
Yeah. In general, traditionally, the conservatives knew better. There is this cultural difference. When conservatives are angry with the public policy, they want to change the public policy. People on the left have been more inclined to blame the whole system and not want to work within the system. And yeah, that has been true with the rules, where the conservatives understood them better, partly because that was a way to sort of stop things. And too many liberals were just content to advocate. Yeah. Exactly. The purity of the advocacy was what did it. And several people complained. I yelled at them. I said, yeah, this is, the more serious you are about your ideals, the greater the moral obligation to be serious about implementing them. This notion that you've satisfied your obligation by articulately and eloquently expressing an ideal, and therefore you don't have to worry about getting them implemented, is self-indulgence.
Well, that's the third time, maybe it's the fourth, that you've used the word self-indulgence, which I think is interesting. And I do think that you make a very eloquent case for the problem of, I wonder if this self-indulgence has gotten greater, although I would say during the Vietnam War period, a lot was lost through a certain, as you say, through self-indulgence. Do you think that's escalated since, and that people feel that if they feel something or they're idealists, that's enough?
Well, I think it's been pretty much a constant in this. And as I said, I wish the right was that way, but they tend to, it's like they're
more disciplined?
Well, it's our country, and so they're going to, the Tea Party is much more extreme ideologically than many of the people on the left, if you're judging from the center. But they're very disciplined politically. They vote in primaries.
I want to talk about your involvement in financial reform, because you were You were involved in the implementation of TARP, and you understood the complexity of the situation.
And there was no option. And by the way, the federal government made money on that, but here was the deal. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, and it looked like AIG might collapse, people stopped lending each other money. Now, our economy is based on loans all the time. And if people don't lend each other money, things collapse. So we had to, and our system of loans was conducted through these financial institutions, banks and others. So people say, well, why are you helping the banks? Because if we didn't help the banks, then the whole society falters. And let me say this, if there had been the kind of further meltdown that would have happened if we didn't do the TARP, Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, would not have gone hungry. Neither would Jamie Dimon. They're both friends, guys I admire. I don't mean to be critical of them. But if, in fact, there had been a further deterioration in the economy, it would be the poorer you are, the worse off it would be. The rich people had big cushions. So this notion that we were only helping the banks and not the citizens, avoiding a total collapse of the economy hurts the citizens. The Great Depression was caused in part by people in the stock market, but the ones who got really crushed were the average working citizens. Now, at the same time that we did the TARP to stave off total disaster, we did go to work to make sure you wouldn't have to do it again, or not make sure, because you cannot guarantee it, but to make it less likely that we'd have to do it again.
With the Dodd-Frank Act.
With the bill, yeah.
Yes, which is, I mean, it must be gratifying to you to have your name attached to a bill that really did presumably put some
I think it's clearly
restraints.
worked. Look, one proof, the financial industry used to give 60% of the money to Republicans, 40% to Democrats. After we passed the bill, it was about 98-2. I mean, they're very angry because we have restrained them. We have cut into what they were doing, and I'm proud of that, and we've made it much less likely that we'll have a crisis again.
So you're proud of that? You're proud
Absolutely.
of that bill? So,
And I should add, by the way, people should know, people said what's going to happen. It's being protected now. There was a little bit of the president got a little lax on it, but Nancy Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren, some others, I joined in. The Democrats are now from Hillary Clinton put out a tweet saying we can't let financial reform go. That will be one of the issues that we have to make clear to people in the next year's election. If the Republicans win, it's pretty clear they will abolish financial reform and go back to where we were with this kind of unregulated manipulation. And they're not going to say that, but it's clear from their record, and it's going to be up to the Democratic candidate to say, I'm going to protect financial regulation as opposed to my opponent.
So what do you think about the future of this country? I mean, are you one of the depressed people about the polarization that seems to have occurred? Or, I mean, you are a man who was able to compromise. Do you feel compromise is dead? Do you feel we're getting more and more polarized?
We are clearly that way now. I do not think, I think ultimately the rigidity and right-wing extremism of the Tea Party will be rejected. The unusual circumstances have kept them going. Ultimately, look, our economy's in pretty good shape. We're growing, even with all of our problems, better than anybody else in the world. So I'm ultimately optimistic. We have the resources to do a lot better. To me, though, it is critical. We have got to stop this excessive military spending. You know, 40 years ago, we could defend the whole world. We have this self-imposed heavy burden that we're carrying that we have to lay down.
Do you miss your time in Congress? I mean, you still obviously are talking and writing and commentating and so forth. Do you miss the restraints, let's put it that way, of having to get something
No,
through?
in fact, I couldn't go back to that. That's very emotionally wearing. You know, it's a lot easier just to advocate. The toughest part of the job is when you get down to it and there's something you care about very much and you can't get it all and you have to decide, is this enough? Do I keep pushing? Do I walk away from it? That decision about how much to compromise on your most cherished values is the most emotionally draining. So I don't miss that. I enjoyed having done it, but after 40 years, I didn't have the energy to do it. I miss some of my friends, but by and large, if someone offered me something, you know, a Senate seat for a year tomorrow, I would say no.
So would you consider yourself in retirement, or
Yes.
you think that you
I've
have a pretty grueling
retired.
schedule?
I have no day-to-day responsibilities. I'm doing this book tour, which is pretty busy, although it's not as strenuous as a campaign would be. But I've retired. That is, I have no day-to-day responsibilities. If I want to stay home, I stay home. I have some opportunities to participate in the public debate, but I guess the best way to say it is that at this point, because people have this myth about how well compensated members of Congress are, certainly not for the hours. By my first year out, I was making about 4.5 times as much money, with about 10% of the work and about 2% of the stress. So I'll take that.
Well, I want to thank you enormously for being here. I think you're a great man.
Oh, I appreciate this
I
opportunity.
enjoyed this enormously.
It's a great format,
I
and
learned a
thank you.
tremendous amount from you, and I loved your book.
Thank you.
And I hope you will continue to write and speak for many years to come.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel interview.